Okay, then why do I have hay fever?
Because there are imperfections still around. There are lots of genes which are in the gene pool being shuffled by sexual reproduction, and natural selection is constantly removing them, but mutation is constantly adding them. Sexual reproduction is constantly reshuffling them. There are
so mutation is mutation
is random. Mutation is the process by which new genes enter the gene pool. That's random, but it's vitally important to understand that natural selection itself is not random, because one of the commonest misunderstandings, and the one that the creationists really play on all the time, is they think it's a theory of random chance. And if it really were a theory of random chance, then of course it couldn't explain anything that we see in the way of complex life.
What would lead them to suppose that? I mean, especially if the whole point is what's going to survive. It isn't like you hit the lucky 8-ball.
No, that's right. I mean, it is the exact opposite of random. I can only suppose that, I mean, the cynical in me thinks that it's just the way which they win round simple people. Because obviously any fool can see that randomness cannot be the explanation for life. I mean, that's the starting point. Any decent theory of life has got to depart from randomness.
Let's talk in terms of that then. What is the origin of life? You say it was like, 5 billion years ago?
About 4 billion years ago. The origin of life, nobody was there to see it. We don't know what happened. There are various theories.
Well, if someone was there to see it, there would already been life.
Sorry?
I'm just being stupid.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just didn't hear over the phone line.
It's not worth it. So go ahead. So
it was a chemical event, and we know the kind of chemical event it must have been. It was the origin of the first self-replicating entity. DNA is a self-replicating molecule. It wouldn't have been DNA, but it would have been something a bit like DNA, something much simpler than DNA, that had the singular property of making copies of itself. Now, once that happened, then Darwinian natural selection got going. So that very first step, you probably could call a random chance step. But once that had happened, then you have the non-random process of natural selection taking over.
That's what I wanted to ask. Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to ask some like dumb questions I should know the answer to. How did the different races of man evolve?
All right, we're talking to Richard Dawkins, an Oxford professor for the public understanding of science. You're listening to the Al Franken Show here on Air America Radio. You're listening to the Al Franken Show. I'm Catherine Lanford.
And I'm Al Franken. With us is Richard Dawkins. He's a professor for the public understanding of science at Oxford University. He's championed Darwinism for nearly 20 years. He's authored several books on evolution, and he is joining us from Colorado Springs, Colorado. Professor.
Yes.
I have often wondered, how did the different races of man evolve?
One of the chapters in my book, The Ancestor's Tale, is devoted to that. The Grasshopper's Tale, it's called. Races you could think of as being the first step in the divergent evolution which ultimately might become species. But in the case of human races, they are very, very close genetically, so they haven't diverged very far. Human species is unusually uniform genetically, so that in spite of the superficial differences between human races, we are very, very close. There's far more genetic variation within races than there is between races.
I see.
Nevertheless, there is a certain residue of differences which are characteristic of different geographical regions, different geographical races.
Well, what about, wasn't there some research that came out within the last few years that suggested that race is just a social construct anyway?
Well, that's got to be nonsense, but it is true that there are people who say that. It's perfectly clear that if you take, suppose you did the following experiment and you took photographs of of people from, let's say, Uganda, Iceland, India, Japan, and somewhere else, and you handed these photographs to people and got them to sort them, they would, with 100% success, pick out the ones that were from Uganda, the ones that were from Iceland, the ones that were from...
What if the guy from Iceland was Japanese?
Well, of course, that would...
See, I fooled you there.
That fooled you there, but assuming that he didn't do that.
No, I know what you mean.
That's a sufficient demonstration that there is something real going on. And you can find it in the genes. It's just that you don't find very much difference. I mean, if you asked the Victorian scientists, they would have thought that there was massive differences between the genes. And even the early evolutionists thought that some races were kind of closer to apes than other races. And that's absolute nonsense. All human races today are equally close to other apes. We're all cousins of each other, and then we're more distant cousins of apes. The closeness of our cousinship to chimpanzees is exactly the same, whichever race we belong to.
I want to get into something else. This is we have this thing called Fox News here in the United States.
Oh, I know all about that.
Yeah, and they have a host, Tony Snow, and he said that this is a quote: "Evolutionary theorists find themselves at wit's end because the fossil record provides no evidence of any species ever turning into another."
Absolute bollocks. There are numerous examples. I mean, the fossil record is rich in transitional forms. It is true that there are certain gaps where there are no fossils, and that's exactly what you'd expect, because the chance that a corpse will turn into a fossil is very, very low. I mean, I hope that when I die I shall turn into a fossil, but I know that the odds are very, very much against it. So there are enormous gaps in the fossil record.
Can you do anything? Can a person do anything to guarantee that it'll turn into a fossil?
I think you need to be washed away in a flood, buried under mud rather rapidly.
Okay.
So that a hyena doesn't get you, or a dog doesn't get you.
But so there are fossil records that provide evidence that species turned into.
Of course there are. And in a way, far more important, there are no fossils that are in the wrong place. When the great British biologist this would be a beautiful disproof. J.B.S. Haldane was asked what would disprove evolution, and he growled, "Fossil rabbits in the Precambrian." In other words, there may be an absence of some fossil where you'd like it to be, but what there are not, absolutely not, is a fossil in the wrong place. There should be a fossil in the wrong place if it were creationist. And by the way, when you think about the demand that there should be no gaps in the fossil record, the equivalent demand to a creationist is that there should be a complete cinematic record of God's every action on the day that he created the mollusks or the mammals or whatever it might be. That's the equivalent demand, that you should have a fossil to document every stage of the way. Of course we don't have fossils to document.
And they don't have that film of God, do they?
They do not. No.
See?
All right. In the few seconds we have left, Richard Dawkins, where do you see this debate going in this country?
Well, I'm very worried about the way this country is going. I see this country as polarizing between a sort of intelligent, educated wing and a completely benighted, ignorant wing. And I have to stress, ignorance is not a crime. I don't blame people who think the world was created in 6 days. They just have never been educated any better. And I think that's tragic. I think it doesn't do justice to people that they should have been let down by the educational system, which is obviously excellent in all sorts of other respects, but they've been let down in that they do not understand what we know to be a fact.
Professor Dawkins, we have to say farewell. Thank you so much for joining us.
Please join us again.
That's Richard Dawkins. You can find out more about him at the alfrankenshow.com.